Good evening, everyone. Hello. Welcome to Nevala-Lee. Welcome to our first lecture of the 2025-2026 season. I feel like I'm getting feedback. We're really excited you're here and looking forward to a great season of lectures, of talks, and hope to see you at all of them. We're also very grateful to Enterprise Bank and Trust. They are our sponsor for this season, and their generous support helps to allow programs like this to continue for the Historical Society. Tonight, it's my honor to introduce our speaker, Alec Nevala-Lee. He is an acclaimed author whose works include Astounding and Inventor of the Future, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times and the Atlantic. Tonight, he'll be speaking about his newest book, Collisions, a physicist's journey from Hiroshima to the death of the dinosaurs. It is the first full biography of Nobel Prize winning physicist Luis Alvarez. Please join me in welcoming Alec.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you so much to the Los Alamos Historical Society for inviting me here. I think giving this talk about this man in this room is perhaps the coolest thing I've ever done. So thank you for coming out and being a part of it. Whenever I talk about Luis Alvarez, I'll just start with this quote, which is actually the epigraph to the book. All right, gossip is the backbone of physics. And this is a quote that Alvarez attributes to Robert Oppenheimer in several letters. So what is he talking about here? So if I asked Alvarez what he meant, I think he would say physicists can't just rely on what's been published. They have to be aware of what people are talking about, what they are thinking about doing, maybe what they've done that hasn't worked, because all this information is going to be useful. So it's very important for a scientist to keep their ear to the ground. But obviously there's another meaning here. I like to quote another one of my heroes, Emma Thompson, who once said that gossip is discussion about life's detail. Because, this is a very science-heavy story, obviously, but it's also a human story, all right? And Alvarez, his life furnishes more material for exploring the human side of science than almost anyone I can think of. In fact, there's so much of it that I'm going to tell you briefly a few of the things that I'm not going to be talking about tonight, all right? I am not going to be talking about what won him the Nobel Prize, his work on the bubble chamber, which was, an incredibly important project. I'm not going to be talking about his work on the Kennedy assassination, which is fascinating. I'm not going to be talking about his attempt to X-ray the pyramids, which was a very unusual project. And perhaps most unforgivably, I am not going to be talking about his work with his son Walter to prove that the asteroid or the extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs was caused by an asteroid impact. That said, if during the Q&A you want to ask me about any of those things, please do. I'll be here all night. As long as people want to keep talking, there's a lot we could discuss. So if I'm not going to talk about those things, what am I talking about? And I think maybe the best way to explain is to start here. All right, so that scene is pretty accurate, all right? Although watching it again now, the one thing I think of is like, man, Alvarez could have met Florence Pugh, and he missed her by that much, poor guy. So this is a true story, all right? And this is, to me, incredible. So Alvarez really was getting his hair cut one day in January 1939, and he saw a newspaper article that revealed the fact that had been known for weeks, in other physics circles, that a German chemist, Otto Hahn, had split the atom. He did run to the lab to tell people, including Oppenheimer, although it wasn't until the next day that he set up the very simple experimental setup that you saw here that demonstrated to Oppenheimer that fission was indeed taking place. So, as far as movies go, it's very accurate. The one thing I will say is that, so Alex Wolff on the left, I think does a nice job as Alvarez. He does not really resemble the real Alvarez. So the real Alvarez was 6'1", blonde, blue-eyed. One thing I should clarify, because this is a point of confusion, is that, as one scholar puts it, Alvarez was a white man with a Hispanic last name. All right, so just to clarify. After this scene, Alvarez disappears from the movie. I know what happened, in fact, is that the movie is based on the book American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, which is a fantastic book. And I read it before the movie came out. And I read that scene. I'm like, that scene's got to be in the movie because it's cinematic, it's funny, it's interesting. And so I was waiting for that moment. And when I saw Alvarez, I got very excited. But that's really the only time that Alvarez appears in that book. All right. So if Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin had included Alvarez in other places, I'm fairly sure that Alvarez would have been featured in Oppenheimer much more prominently. So what I'm going to do for the next half hour or so is give you essentially the alternate cut of Oppenheimer, in which Alvarez plays a role that is very important and very interesting. Who is this guy? I'm going to do a very quick introduction to his life. Alvarez was born in 1911 in the Bay Area. And famously, he originally wanted to go to college at UC Berkeley, which his mother and sister had attended, but he was advised to go to Chicago because Chicago at the time was the home of the 3 living American Nobel laureates in physics. So he goes to Chicago, and a few years later, he goes back to Berkeley because he finds that in Chicago, there's nothing going on. They are sitting around reminiscing about the good old days. He says, like a Tennessee Williams play. They aren't actually doing any real science in Chicago. The action is back in Berkeley. So in 1936, he goes back to Berkeley to work with the man on the right, Ernest Lawrence, pictured here with his colleague M. Stanley Livingston, and in particular, to work on this machine. This is the cyclotron. So this is the particle accelerator that Lawrence invented and developed that essentially turned Berkeley into a powerhouse for physics. I won't get into what the cyclotron was really used for. It generated a beam of particles that could be used to bombard and pick up atoms, make things radioactive. But this is the very early days of this tool. But already people are so excited that most of the staff at the Berkeley Radiation Lab works there for free. These are men of independent means who are so interested in what this machine can do that they're willing to go without a salary. Alvarez, shows up. And he realizes that the Lawrence lab, or the radiation lab, isn't really fully exploiting what this tool can do. So what he becomes known for, almost from day one, is he is very good at figuring out how to use the technology that we already have to think of applications that haven't occurred to anybody else. And Lawrence notices this. Within a few years, he sees Alvarez as essentially the most talented physicist, in his lab. This is a time when Berkeley is becoming kind of like a mecca for scientists to gather to work on physics, including a man in the back row, middle, you might recognize Robert Oppenheimer. So Oppenheimer is a theorist, all right, and Alvarez is an experimentalist. So they don't really work together that closely, but they're friends, right? This is an important point. They are socially friendly. They hold each other in high mutual respect. And I would say that by 1939, Alvarez and Oppenheimer is seen as perhaps the 2 brightest people at Berkeley. But they don't work together just yet. So tonight, I am going to have to skip over a lot of really interesting stuff because what happens is that in the buildup before America's entry into World War II, Alvarez is recruited by Lawrence to join the MIT radar project. And this is a big deal. Radar is one of the biggest secrets of the war, bigger at the time in some ways than the atomic bomb program. And Alvarez, this is worth noting, he is not a radar expert. He hasn't even heard of radar at that point, but he is known as someone who has good ideas, who sees things that other people don't see, and can then build things. He can turn those ideas into actual, realized equipment and technology that will be useful during the war. But he's also aware of the Manhattan Project. He stays in touch with Oppenheimer, this entire time. And in 1943, Oppenheimer comes to Alvarez and essentially pitches him on joining the Manhattan Project. So at the time, this is 1944. Oppenheimer essentially tells Alvarez that they've almost figured out the problem of building a nuclear bomb. At that point, they think that, so there are going to be two kinds of bombs. There's going to be the uranium bomb and the plutonium bomb. And they're pretty sure that they can use the same method to achieve a critical mass for both uranium and plutonium. It's called the gun method. So you basically fire one piece of fissile material at another to create a critical mass. So he says to Alvarez, well, we're almost done with like the interesting stuff, but there's another bomb, the fusion bomb, that we're hoping to develop pretty soon. And this is the bomb that relies on fusion, not fission. That's a much more powerful explosion. And that, essentially Oppenheimer expects that the Manhattan Project will soon pivot to the fusion problem. And this is the kind of like the carrot he extends to Alvarez to encourage him to come join. And so Alvarez says, that sounds great. He has to do a few things first. He goes to Chicago and Argonne Lab to work with Fermi for a while. But then in April of 1944, he heads down to Los Alamos. So when he first arrives, and this is one other thing I should mention. So before his arrival, they discuss whether or not they want Alvarez there earlier. And I think Hans Bethe is the one who raises Alvarez as a potential candidate for the Manhattan Project. And Edward Teller says no. He says that we actually are not very eager to have Alvarez. And there are two readings of this statement. Either it's because they thought that Alvarez's work on radar was too important and that he was better, suited there. Or some historians think that it was Alvarez's ego that made them reluctant to bring him on board. So we'll just put a pin in that for now. So in 1944, Alvarez arrives and actually stays here at first in Fuller Lodge. And his wife and son are preparing to join him, Geraldine, who's actually pregnant at the time with their second child, and Walter, who's 4. So he wants to get, like a nice accommodation for his family. And at the time, the best available apartments are in units of 4. And so they have a contact at the lodge or at the Manhattan Project that says that she can arrange for them to get a nice place. What happens is that their neighbors are told that the Alvarezes are moving in. And for various reasons, they associate that last name with the people that do the cleaning and the maintenance work. And they are horrified at their potential loss of social standing until they are reassured that, no, this guy is a scientist. He's, a member of your social class, let's say. So Geraldine moves in. She has her baby here, Jean Alvarez, who is still alive, who I've met. And Alvarez gets to work. So initially, he's assigned to work with his next-door neighbor at the lodge, George Kistakowski, who is an explosives expert. And what he is currently working on is a design for the plutonium bomb that at first seems like it's not going to be needed. It's called the implosion method. And when Alvarez arrives, it's kind of seen as like a backup plan. But soon after his arrival, they realize that the gun method that they are going to be using for the uranium bomb won't work for plutonium. The short version is that if you try to use the gun method for plutonium assembly, it's too slow. And it needs to be faster, because if it's too slow, it will just kind of fizzle out. You won't get the atomic explosion you want. So they pivot to a different design, all right? And this is called, this is the implosion method. And the idea is that you have a core plutonium that you use explosives to compress down to a smaller size that is the right size for a critical mass. This is a much harder problem than the gun method, all right? So you can look at this diagram of these, what are called explosive lenses. These are explosives that fit on the outside of the plutonium core, and they are in essentially the shape of a soccer ball, all right? So there are 12 pentagons and 20 hexagons, and all of these explosives have to go off at the same time, and it has to be totally symmetrical, otherwise the bomb isn't going to work. And so Kistakowski and Alvarez are assigned to the problem of how do we make these explosions simultaneous, which is actually like a pretty hard problem because at the time, the detonators they're using, they have spreads of up to like half a millisecond, which is much too big, right? It's not going to work. They have to find a new way of setting off these explosions at the same time. And initially, what they do is they have one fuse for each lens that is then hooked up to one detonator that will set off 32 fuses. And Alvarez says, well, why don't you do it the other way around? Why don't you attach one detonator to each lens, so you have 32 electric detonators? And Kistikowski says, no, that's even worse because the spacing in the electric detonators is worse than it is for the fuses. So what Alvarez does is he invents, or he comes up with the idea for something called the exploding bridge wire detonator. So this is a picture I took at Bradbury Museum about a year ago when I was out here on my last trip to Los Alamos. So if you go there, they have an entire display that talks about these detonators. And so what Alvarez realizes is that, and just to underline the fact, Alvarez is not an explosives expert. He barely knows anything about explosives, but he's the kind of guy where he shows up, you give him a problem, he reads everything he can, he talks to everyone, and comes up with like an idea that hasn't occurred to anybody else. So what he realizes is that, so these detonators, normally they involve a wire that you heat up with an electric current, then sets off a primer, like a lower power explosive, that then sets off a high explosive. And he says, well, why don't we just skip the primer part? Why don't we just blast the wire with so much electric power that it blows up itself, it explodes, and then it can set off the high explosive without the need for the primer. And so Kistikowski says, sure, let's try it. So basically, Alvarez goes off into South Mesa with his friend Lawrence Johnston, and they blow things up. They spend months on this problem trying to figure out how to reduce the spread between the detonators. And they eventually end up with a design that looks kind of like this. So just to kind of give context as to what you're looking at here. So this big round plate, this is called the X unit, and it is essentially the capacitor that sends a huge surge of electric current through this detonator. So imagine this hooked up to a bunch of these little guys, which you saw on the previous slide. This is what Alvarez worked on, all right? And this was a crucial part of the plutonium bomb. If these detonators hadn't worked, there wouldn't have been, for better or for worse, an implosion system. So you can see here, this is where it fits into the Fat Man bomb. This is the round X unit that you saw earlier, hooked up by wires to the implosion mechanism. And so you can imagine like each of these detonators is hooked up to one of the 32 explosive lenses that will be required to set off the plutonium bombs. So if you recall your history, you know that there were 2 plutonium bombs and 1 uranium bomb. The first plutonium bomb was detonated at the Trinity test, all right? And this is Alvarez's sketch because he was there. He was actually in a plane, a B-29 bomber, about 25 miles away from the Trinity test when the bomb went off. And he actually says that he and his team were up there and they realized that they forgot to bring a camera. And so he was forced to very quickly make a sketch and write up a report, which includes actually the first known use of the term mushroom cloud. So he's the first person that I know of who actually compared the cloud to a mushroom. So why is he here? Alvarez had finished his work on the detonators, but he wants to do more. He wants to be in Japan when the bombs are used, all right? And he goes to Oppenheimer, and he says, is there a project that you can assign me to that will allow me to be in Japan for the bombings? And Oppenheimer says, well, as a matter of fact, there is. So we've just, we're about to set off the bomb at the Trinity test. And this is a controlled test. It's on a proving ground. We can set up our instrumentation and record how big the blast was. But we can't do that for the uranium bomb because we only have 1. all right, this uranium bomb is going to be used against the Japanese, and we don't have any way of measuring how powerful it is. So he asked Alvarez to come up with a system that will allow them to measure the bomb's explosive force in battle. So when Alvarez is actually like in this plane, he is testing his idea for how to measure the blast pressure. So this is another photograph from the Bradbury Museum. You can tell that I've been doing my research very thoroughly. If you go there, there's an entire display devoted to this very interesting project. So Alvarez thinks about the various ways you could measure the blast pressure, and he realizes that you can treat the shock wave from the bomb as a sound wave. And so essentially, these are microphones. He creates these gauges that have two microphones inside. They're dropped by parachute from the observation plane. And they can pick up the shock wave from the bomb and then transmit that information to a receiver on the plane that is hooked up to an oscilloscope. And the oscilloscope is actually going to be filmed by a 16 millimeter camera. And then you can take that film and develop it, analyze the waves, and use that to estimate the explosive force of the bomb. So this is what Alvarez is doing at Trinity. So he's in his plane, he wants to test the gauges. And then actually at the last minute, Oppenheimer says, no, it's too dangerous, you can't go more than 25 miles, from the detonation site. And Alvarez gets really mad. He says, this is my one chance to test these things before we go to Japan. And he says he was so angry at Oppenheimer that he's never been as angry with anyone before or since. So he has to go to Japan, without having tested these gauges properly, under those conditions. But he's still very excited. I mean, this is his excuse to go, because he really wants to be there when the bomb is used. And he ends up being the senior scientific observer at Hiroshima. He's the most senior scientist who actually worked on the Manhattan Project who saw the bomb being used. So this is a picture of Alvarez at Tinian, the island from which the bombers were launched. He's holding the actual plutonium core that was used for the Fat Man bomb. So he goes to Tinian. He arrives there on July 26, 1945. So he spends a few days preparing the gauges. And then on August 6th, he gets on board a plane called the Great Artiste, which is the B-29 observation plane that will accompany the Nevala-Lee to Hiroshima. So here's what he sees. So he's flying behind the Nevala-Lee. They are approaching Hiroshima. He's actually in the back of the plane, and the windows have been taped over, so he can't really see outside. He's focused entirely on the gauges. He's wearing headphones, and he hears a tone that is set to last for 1 minute, which indicates that the automatic firing sequence has begun. And after the tone stops, it means the bomb is dropped. So the tone stops, he starts a stopwatch, and he knows that he has about 45 seconds before the bomb goes off, because it has to drop about 30,000 feet. So the plane takes a diving turn to get away from the detonation site. He's looking at the gauges, and then he sees a flash of light pass down the interior of the plane from the cockpit window. And at that moment, he knows that the bomb has worked. But he's very focused on his, the task at hand. He feels two shock waves hit the plane. The first one is from the bomb itself, and the second is from the reflection of the bomb shock wave of the ground. And it feels like being on a garbage can that's hit by a baseball bat. So he successfully films the oscilloscope screens, finishes calibrating the equipment, and then goes back around to the front of the plane. And so for the first time, he goes to the cockpit, looks out, and sees what is outside. And he says that at first he thinks that they missed. He thinks that they dropped the bomb by mistake in the middle of nowhere, because he looks down and just sees an empty wilderness. And his first thought is, we've wasted all this uranium that Lawrence, spent so much time trying to enrich. But then they tell him, no, we were right on target. Hiroshima is just gone. So they fly back to Tinian. Famously, on the flight home, Alvarez writes a letter to his son, Walter, who is 4 at the time. And he basically says, well, we just took part in the killing and maiming of thousands of Japanese, but I hope that this will be, the bomb that makes war obsolete. And he says that Alfred Nobel thought that his invention of dynamite would do the same. He was wrong, but maybe this will be, the weapon that ends all wars. So it would be, and I almost forgot, this is the best part. So the results, they get back to Tinian, and Alvarez runs to the dark room, develops the film, and writes out these notes, and gives the numbers to one of his colleagues to calculate how powerful the bomb was. So this, again, is another image from the Bradbury Museum. And I'm not going to say this caption is wrong, but it's not right, okay? Because it says that Alvarez, got an estimate of the yield of the little boy bomb about 15 kilotons. So actually, he was off. So the actual estimate that he got at the time was about 8.7 kilotons. It was about 40% too low. And this is consistent. This is what the gauges always got. The gauges are always a little bit off, all right? So Alvarez did not accurately estimate the bomb's strength. That 15 kiloton estimate is from a much later date. The gauges, judged purely as scientific instruments, I would say had a very mixed performance, but they did what they were meant to do, all right? The gauges got Alvarez where he wanted to be an eyewitness to history. So it would be very convenient to end the story there, all right? But there's a little bit more, and I should talk about this because in some ways this is one of the most difficult parts of the story to talk about. So Alvarez always defended the decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Essentially, he said that if they had not been bombed with the atomic bomb, we would have firebombed them anyway, because he'd seen the planes taking off from Tinian, for the firebombing of Japan. And he said that, the bombs were the fire break that stopped the fire from consuming Japan. And that's an argument that, makes sense within the logic of a world war, with, horrible things committed on both sides. But he had very little patience for scientists who did not share that belief that the bombing was justified. He said that after he went back to Los Alamos, he found his colleagues there almost neurotic about the use of the bombs, and he said that he had no sympathy for them. He said that they had not seen men go into combat the way he had and didn't understand the stakes. And so, he did not ever express ambivalence or regret over the bombings. And this is, in contrast to Oppenheimer. So Oppenheimer famously said, the physicists have known sin. He said that he felt that he had blood on his hands. Alvarez would not have understood that. And this comes up a few years later after Russia detonates their first atomic bomb in 1949. Alvarez reacts, along with Lawrence, by saying, well, now we have to build the super. We have to build the fusion bomb that Oppenheimer told me about all those years ago that was going to be the next obvious step. And so they go to Washington and advocate very strongly that they begin a thermonuclear bomb program. And he expects Oppenheimer to agree. And he is shocked to find that Oppenheimer is opposed to the H-bomb. Alvarez says that Oppenheimer told him that, well, if we build an H-bomb, the Russians will build an H-bomb, and if we don't, the Russians won't. And he said that he found that logic hard to understand. But I think it's very clear that Oppenheimer foresaw the arms race. He said that this is a process that once started can't be undone. Obviously, Oppenheimer's reservations did not delay the H-bomb program, which was implemented as Alvarez wanted. But Alvarez, at that point, was very suspicious of Oppenheimer. He felt that because they're both smart men and came to different conclusions, that maybe Oppenheimer was acting out of bad faith or even treason. He became concerned about Oppenheimer's associations with communists. And, deep down, I think he knew that Oppenheimer was going to be a difficult person to have as part of the conversation around the bomb program. So, in 1954, Oppenheimer famously was subjected to a security hearing. That, if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, you've seen a lot of that material. In the movie, you see Teller testify against Oppenheimer. But Alvarez was also one of the very few government scientists who testified on the government's behalf. against Oppenheimer. He did not, he knew that it was going to be controversial. He knew it was going to be unpopular. And there's a famous story where Lawrence is actually very afraid that people will see him and Alvarez as being part of this conspiracy to take Oppenheimer down. So Lawrence withdraws from the hearing. He encourages Alvarez to do the same. And then one night, Alvarez gets a call from Louis Strauss, Robert Downey Jr.'s character in Oppenheimer, who kind of berates him and tells him that he owes it to his country to testify against Oppenheimer. Alvarez hangs up the phone and he thinks for 2 hours. And we don't really know what he thinks about, but in the book I have some thoughts about this, because he says he poured himself a stiff drink and booked a plane to Washington. And the next day he testified. So, Alvarez knew this was going to be a part of his legacy that would overshadow his other achievements. In his memoir, interestingly enough, he doesn't really talk about this. I actually got to read the uncut original draft of his autobiography, which is a massive document that covers every episode in his career. And when it was published, before he died, it was edited by Richard Rhodes, the author of The Making of the Atomic Bomb. I've talked to Rhodes about this, and he said that, he looked at the manuscript and he said, Alvarez, you don't talk about the Oppenheimer hearing at all. And Alvarez said, no, I don't want to go there. So if you look at the autobiography, Alvarez's autobiography, that chapter is ghostwritten by Richard Rhodes based on the Oppenheimer hearing transcript. Alvarez never really talked about his personal feelings about the Oppenheimer trial or the Oppenheimer hearing. He knew that people talked about it. He knew that maybe they whispered about it behind his back. He claimed that he'd never experienced firsthand, antagonism over it. But I think deep down he knew that, this was going to be an important part of his legacy. And I want to close for now with a quote that I found in an interview that was unpublished during his lifetime, where he talks a bit about what happened afterward. So Alvarez says, Oppie and I meet once a year at the High Energy Physics Conference held in Rochester. The first year after the hearing, Oppie didn't speak to me, very pointedly ignored me. The second year he spoke to me, but his wife snubbed me. And the third year, Oppie and his wife were both cordial. Since then, they acted as if nothing had happened, although we know that something did happen. Any questions? So I was very serious when I said that I didn't talk about a lot of really cool things that Alvarez did. So if you want to hear about any of those topics, please feel free to ask, and I will answer as many questions as I can.
Could you tell us a little bit about what it was like to work with Oppenheimer, with Alvarez? I've read that he was very difficult to work with.
Yeah, this is a great story. So when I first pitched this book, the way you pitch a nonfiction book is you have to write up a proposal, all right? So it's like 20, 30 pages where you explain who this guy is and why there should be a book about him. So I wrote an entire proposal based on Alvarez's autobiography, which seemed like the obvious source for all this material. I said, he did all these interesting things, and it seemed like like a very positive person, like the picture he paints of himself and that autobiography is of this nice guy who people love to work with, never caused any problems. And then I came across like another quote from a different source that said that Alvarez was referred to as that son of a bitch at Berkeley. And I was like, what does that refer to? And I found all these other sources, that refer to him as being someone who craved power and loved, control, especially when he could use it to cause pain. I don't know if that's actually fair to him, but there's no question that he was difficult. There's a guy named Richard Muller who is still around, who was one of his proteges, who said to me that Alvarez was probably the most hated physicist at Berkeley, during his time there. And I think the answer is that he was just really hard on people. He, expected, for example, if you made a mistake, to admit it at once in public, and if you tried to push back, he would go after you. He could be hard on his subordinates and on his students and his colleagues. And this is part of his personality that even his family, I would say, would acknowledge. And the most generous reading I have of that is that Alvarez understood the stakes. He knew that he and his colleagues were lucky enough to be working in physics during one of the most, remarkable times imaginable. And that if you, didn't take it seriously, he didn't know how to talk to you. But it's also true that his personality made it hard for him to work with certain people in ways that probably affected the things he couldn't do.
Hi. Did Alvarez actually work on the H-bomb project?
Not directly. He really wanted to. So the story here is that in '49, after the Russians detonated their first atomic bomb, he and Lawrence go on this tour of Washington, trying to sell the idea to officials in the government, and they really want Berkeley to be the center of it, right? They want to build reactors in Berkeley that can be used to generate neutrons, that can be used to make tritium for the hydrogen bomb. And so Alvarez is essentially moving into his new office. He's already getting ready to get started when Oppenheimer essentially nixes the project. And so he really wanted to be part of it. He worked on some other projects with Lawrence that were designed to kind of claim a piece of the H-bomb project for Berkeley, but it ended up being done by other people.
So along those lines, was he involved in this material test accelerator at the Livermore site, and did he subsequently do any work at Livermore? I'm not aware of it.
Wow, yeah, so this ties in directly with this question. So after Oppenheimer's, so what happened is that Oppenheimer's opposition to the bomb program in '49 kind of derails their original plans to set up a reactor program in Berkeley. And so Lawrence is like, well, what else can we do? Let's find a way that we can, make nuclear materials, fissile materials for the H-bomb at Berkeley or in California in a way that we can kind of claim for ourselves. And the result is this thing called the Materials Testing Accelerator, which is a euphemism. It doesn't really reflect what it did. But basically it's a really huge linear accelerator that you can use to bombard stuff to make fissile material. And Alvarez is assigned to this project, and it involves making this massive prototype at Livermore, which is 60 feet in diameter. I mean, it's one of the biggest things you could imagine. And it doesn't really work. It produces a very weak beam. It costs a lot of money. And it wastes 2 years of Alvarez's life. He's essentially, I would say he feels very bitter in the end that he was, tasked with working on that project because it ended up not being used for the bomb program. It ended up not being useful for science. And so he comes back to Berkeley feeling as though he's just lost 2 of the most productive years of his life. And he's actually behind the times. He doesn't understand what his colleagues are even talking about. And it takes him a while to kind of get back up to speed. So that's the one thing he did at Livermore, to my knowledge. And yeah, it was not a happy time.
Was the idea about the meteorite coming of the dinosaurs, was that Walter's idea or was it Lewis's?
So thank you. That's a good question because I can talk about dinosaurs for 2 minutes. This is a father-son story. All right, this is my favorite part of the story because it's about Luis Alvarez realizing that he is getting older and is running out of time to be close to his son, Walter. So Walter is a geologist, and Alvarez famously thinks that geology is not an interesting science. And he is surprised and a little bit confused as to why his son would choose to devote his life to such an uninteresting field. What happens is that one day, Walter goes to Berkeley and he gives his father a piece of rock. All right, this is a little piece of rock that he has polished and turned into a paperweight. And it is from a gorge in Italy where you see a very clear sequence of geological layers. And if you look at this piece of rock, which I actually got to hold in my hand a few weeks ago because I went to see Walter Alvarez in Berkeley, you see this layer of red clay, all right? And below the clay, there are these microorganisms called forams, and they're pretty abundant. You can see them with a little hand lens. And then above the clay, they're all gone. So something happened in that interval. Something happened in the clay layer that wiped out these forams, but also the dinosaurs, because that coincides with like the time that we know that the dinosaurs went extinct. And so Alvarez says, wow, maybe geology is interesting after all. Interesting after all. And so he essentially seizes onto this idea as an excuse to collaborate. He wants to be useful to his son, in the way he's been useful to so many other scientists over the years. And so he tries to figure out, like, how can I help Walt? And so the very short version is that they decide to see how long the clay layer took to form. One way you can tell this is by measuring how much iridium is in the clay from meteorite dust, which settles down to the earth, every year. And so they figure out a way to like measure how much iridium is in this clay layer. And what they find is that there's 30 times as much iridium as they were expecting. And this is a huge surprise. It's not what they were trying to find. And it kind of like comes out of nowhere. And Alvarez says, okay, forget what we were doing before. What we have here is evidence that something happened during this time period that came from space. Something from space had to have caused this, because there's no way the Earth's crust would naturally contain that much iridium. And so Alvarez is the one who starts to brainstorm various possibilities, like a supernova, maybe like a big cloud of hydrogen. And it takes him a while to come up with the asteroid theory, which I think to us now seems kind of obvious, but it was not obvious to him, because essentially, with an asteroid strike, clearly it's going to be fatal to anything that's directly underneath it, but it's not clear how that could cause a global catastrophe. And it takes him a while to realize that maybe it's the dust cloud. Maybe the dust that's kicked up by this asteroid can actually spread worldwide and block out the sun, kill the plants, kill herbivores, and then kill other animals. So that's Alvarez's contribution.
Which Alvarez?
Louis Alvarez, the senior, yes. And so this is a key point. So Alvarez is the one who comes up with the hypothesis, but it's Walter who does the legwork, right? Because it's not enough just to have the idea, you have to find the data to back it up. And this kind of becomes Walter's life's work. So it's a true collaboration. Alvarez is clearly kind of the source for a lot of the big ideas. But without Walter, it never would have happened.
Sorry about that. I guess we're not talking about Edward Teller enough. Any other questions tonight? Well, let's go ahead and give it up for Alec. Thank you very much.